In this tutorial, you'll learn how to quickly create revealing animations for your graphics in Blender using procedural masks. The camera has a simple movement, starting with a slow descent and then quickly accelerating to focus on the can, before easing into a final, slower movement towards it. A default sky texture is used to create long shadows and an almost sunset feel. The sun is positioned behind the entire scene to provide backlighting. I've added a few props, including some plants to enhance the sense of depth. The long shadows they cast contribute to the soft, evening lighting. Notice the circle just in front of the can. I've added that to help maintain focus point on the can itself, since the camera has shallow depth of field, which can blur other areas. There are a few rocks in the scene that I sourced from Blender Kit library. I've made some subtle adjustments to their shaders, specifically by adding a hue, saturation, value node before the base color texture. An area light on the right adds highlights to the can, helping to define its shade. A larger area light is also used as a fill light. Okay, let's jump over to the shader editor. Here's an overview of the whole setup. At the top, we have the basic material for the can itself. The second group down creates the label. I added some roughness and bump maps to give it a bit more visual interest. The third group of nodes is probably the most interesting part. This is where the animation is controlled, using a color ramp. A gradient texture mixed with a noise texture drives the distribution. I then blend this texture with another black and white label texture using a mixed color node set to darken. This final texture is connected to the factor input of a mix shader. It might look complicated at first, but let me show you how to recreate this setup from scratch, and you'll see it's actually pretty straightforward. First, I'm going to add a new material slot. Then, in edit mode, I'll assign this material to the selected polygons. The reason I'm doing this is because the top and bottom of the can already have a metallic material applied, and I don't want those areas affected by our new label material. For simplicity, I'm sticking with the default Principled BSDF shader as a base, but feel free to use whatever material you prefer for the can. Now, let's move on to creating the label. I'm going to copy the texture setup from the second material slot and paste it into the third slot we're working in. You can skip this step though, just drag and drop your texture right into the shader editor. Next, with the texture node selected, I'll press Ctrl T, which will automatically add the UV mapping nodes. Make sure you're using the UV output. After that, I'll add a color ramp. I'll quickly set up a simple roughness map to control the label's glossiness. Darker areas of the label will be glossy, while brighter areas will have a rougher surface. You can adjust this using the color ramp. Then, I'll add a bump node to introduce some subtle height variations. I'm going to slightly decrease the bump strength for now, but we can always adjust that later on. We're done with the basic shader setup. Now let the magic happen. Now, I'm going to add a mixed shader node and connect both of our shaders to it. Next, let's add a gradient texture node and set its type to spherical. Don't forget to add the necessary mapping nodes too. This gradient texture will control the area where the animation will spread outward from and its center point. It's important that the gradient covers the entire area where you want the label animation to appear. To visualize this, you can connect the gradient to a color ramp and set the color ramp to constant. Then, if you move the white slider to the left, you'll see how the spot becomes larger as we move it. I'm adjusting the initial spot position to be closer to the center of the can. However, you can change the origin of your animation by shifting it to the area you want. Alright, now we can add a second gradient. This time, it will be a noise texture node. I'm setting the scale to 6.3 and the detail to the maximum value of 15. This noise texture will define the edges of the spot we created earlier. Feel free to experiment with different settings to get the spot shape you want. Now, let's connect both textures using a mixed color node. Be sure to put the color ramp before the mixed color node. Now, by dragging the white slider on the color ramp, we can see how the textures interact with each other. You can make the spot more rounded by reducing the factor in the mixed color node. I'm using a value around 0.15, but feel free to set your own value. Looks pretty cool, right? But how do we actually make the logo appear from that spot? The next step is to add a black and white mask of the label. I'm going to copy the texture setup from the previous section. It's basically just a PNG image, and I'm going to use its alpha output to extract the mask. Add another mixed color node and connect the texture we just added to the first color input. Then connect the color ramp to the second color input. Set the factor to 1 and change the blending mode to darken. Now everything is set for a stunning animation. Play with the white slider in the color ramp to see how the label magically appears. Don't forget to connect the mixed color node to the factor of the mixed shader node. Now it's time to create the slider animation, because I doubt you want to drag it manually. Bring up the timeline. Choose a frame where you want the animation starts. Set the white slider to its initial position, somewhere on the right side where the label is not visible. Then, hover your mouse over the position on the color ramp. Press I to insert a keyframe at that point. Next, move the slider to the left until the full label appears. Then, insert another keyframe. You'll probably want to change the interpolation mode to linear for a smooth animation. To do this, select both keyframes, press T, and then choose linear. And we're done. Take a look at your model from different angles to evaluate the result. You might want to fine-tune the slider's position if the label isn't fully revealed on the second keyframe. Probably the coolest thing about this technique is that you can apply it to almost any mesh, so you're not limited to cylindrical shapes or any other specific forms. I also did some simple compositing. I used Cryptomatte to isolate the can, allowing me to selectively adjust it. I've added some contrast and boosted the label's colors. There's also a subtle touch of glare, lens distortion, and box sharpen. I used the Cycles render engine with 800 samples per frame. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any new videos. See you in a bit.